Before beginning, I'd like to extend my sincere thanks to the committee for organizing this conference, especially Dr. Takutoshi Inoue and Kyoko Ibe. Mentioning Dard Hunter's name today would likely raise eyebrows among most people as they wonder if they heard his first name correctly, Dard? But if you had done the same thing 70 years ago, chances are that someone in the crowd would associate the name with the maker of, quote, one-man books, unquote, as well as a renowned paper historian. It is estimated that during his lifetime, Dard Hunter was featured in radio interviews and hundreds of newspaper and magazine articles broadcast and published around the world, highlighting his endeavors as a scholar, printer, and publisher of books about handmade paper as practiced globally between the two world wars. But Hunter did not start off life as someone who would be known worldwide as a scholar. Indeed, his first taste of fame was as a performer in his brother's magic show when he was 20 years old. When on a tour to Riverside, California in 1903 with the Phil Hunter Company, Dard discovered the American arts and crafts movement, and this interest led him to join Elbert Hubbard and the Roycrofters in East Aurora, New York in 1904. During his tenure as a Roycrofter, Dard became a nationally known designer of all kinds of mediums, stained glass, metal and wood objects, and most notably printed materials. In the few years that Hunter was there, he single-handedly shifted Roycroft designs from the American arts and crafts to the avant-garde Viennese secessionists. During a visit to London in 1911, Hunter became fascinated with type founding, letterpress printing, and paper making, all as practiced by hand. On his return to America, he bought property in Marlborough, New York, where he built a small paper mill. During the winter months when he couldn't make paper, he cut and cast his own typeface and hand printed a few projects on that paper. The seed to a lifetime of discovery about these book arts, especially handmade paper, was sown in that small mill. Following World War I, the Hunter family moved to Chillicothe, Ohio, into Mountain House that sits on Carlisle Hill, overlooking the town below. And it was in this house that I lived from 1993 to 1996 while researching my book, by his own labor, the biography of Dard Hunter, which was published in 2000. In the Mountain House studio, Hunter printed many books about papermaking using his hand-cut type on Washington-style hand presses. In preparation for these books, Hunter made a number of trips around the world to study and document how native peoples made paper. He also collected their raw materials and equipment whenever he could. The latter he formed into the Dard Hunter Paper Museum that is now part of the Robert C. Williams Museum of Papermaking at Georgia Tech in Atlanta. The first fact-finding trip that Hunter made was to the South Sea Islands in 1926 to study tapa, which he decided to call paper for his book, Primitive Papermaking, published in 1927. Later, he admitted that designating tapa as paper was incorrect. In 1932, Hunter published Old Papermaking in China and Japan. But even before printing was finished, he had decided to visit paper mills in Japan, Korea, and China because he realized that the books he had read on the subject were insufficient, writing that, quote, "The methods of the Orient were not entirely clear to me," unquote. The resulting books from that trip were A Papermaking Pilgrimage to Japan, Korea, and China, published by the Pinson Printers in 1936, shown in this slide, and Chinese Ceremonial Paper, published by Hunter in 1937, which is not shown. Additional trips abroad included Indochina and Siam in 1935, followed by 2 books, Papermaking in Southern Siam in 1926 and Papermaking in Indochina in 1947. And he made a trip to India in 1937-38, followed by Papermaking by Hand in India, published again by the Pinson Printers in 1939. At the same time as these activities were taking place, Hunter had also established a commercial hand papermaking mill in Lime Rock, Connecticut, beginning in 1928, just prior to the Great Depression. While the Lime Rock enterprise was a financial failure, the vast amount of paper produced on spec in the mill ended up in most of the books published by Hunter, from old papermaking in China and Japan in 1932 through his last limited edition book, Papermaking by Hand in America, published in 1950. Because of Hunter's association with Jugaku Bunshō, in whose honor we're meeting, I'd like to spend time briefly describing Hunter's trip to Japan in 1933, and specifically the correspondence between Hunter and Bunshō. By the beginning of 1933, Hunter had finalized plans to travel to Japan by ship, with later side trips to Korea and China. He recalled his motivation for making the trip, quote, "I had read everything available on the subject of Asiatic papermaking, but most of the writers had not been papermakers, and their descriptions failed to give lucid explanations of the various procedures. If I was to acquire a comprehensible understanding, I would have to visit the small mills myself." On March 21st, 1933, Hunter checked into the Imperial Hotel in Tokyo and wrote home the next day, quote, "I was met here at the hotel by a reporter from the large daily Hochi, and he interviewed me and took my picture for the issue tomorrow. All day, I have been in conferences with various Japanese gentlemen who are extremely polite and bow to one another and to me. Tomorrow starts the long journey into the countryside, where things will be vastly different and interesting. I think I will get all that I need here in 2 weeks, or even less, as the plan seems to be quite comprehensive and takes in much within the next week. It is trying to listen intently all the time to the English translation, although my guide, Mr. Yamada, speaks very well, having been to Oberlin College 3 years and Yale 1. It seems strange. Must close now before I am called down for another interview or conference. It seems strange to come to a city 8,000 miles away from home and be well known well enough so the telephone is ringing almost constantly, and I am being called downstairs every few minutes." From Tokyo, Hunter and Yamada went to Gifu, Osaka, Kochi, Nara, Kyoto, and Nagoya, and at each stop, they visited hand and machine paper mills. In Kyoto, he met Jugaku Bunshō, who sent him a letter, care of the Imperial Hotel. "My dear sir, never shall I forget a pleasant day with you in Kyoto. I earnestly desire that you may come to Kyoto again and see me at the nearest opportunity. In your future work on Chinese and Japanese paper, I think some help from a learned Japanese who is well versed in the matter would be in order. As I have told you the other day, there are some noteworthy literature on the history of papermaking in China and Japan, written by living Japanese scholars. Your reference to these will make your admirable work more excellent." Hunter replied, and after briefly describing his recent visit to Korea and outlining his trip home, he suggested, "Perhaps you will be willing to assist me with my next book, so far as related to the spelling of Japanese names, etc. It is, as you must know, most difficult for an Occidental to comprehend Oriental proper names, and heretofore I have had no one to whom I could appeal for information. Perhaps someday we can print a book together by using Japanese paper and English text. What do you think of this idea? Bunshō immediately replied, "Your suggestion about your future work on the art of Japanese papermaking is very excellent and excites my interest. I promise you most willingly I will try to do my very best for your work as far as my knowledge and situation are available. Such a work, I am strongly convinced, will occupy a most brilliant page in the whole province of bibliography, and in that lies one of the highest pleasures which the elect of the great bookdom can alone enjoy. I am looking forward to the day when you will send me a copy of your production, together with samples of your handmade paper and pictures showing your residence and antique paper mill." In June 1933, Hunter returned home, and almost immediately he mailed Bunshō a number of prospectuses of his publications, but after that, their correspondence seems to have ceased for several years. In 1936, Hunter's book about his Japanese trip was published, and it is not thought that Bunshō helped with any translations, etc. However, Bunshō was credited in the book's bibliography as one of the authoritative contributors to the, quote, "past and present papermaking of in Japan," unquote, a 1935 issue of Kogai, a magazine devoted to the arts and crafts movement. And following this, in September 1936, Bunshō sent Hunter a copy of a later issue of Kogai, number 59, writing, "Dear Mr. Hunter, congratulations on the publication of your recent work, Papermaking Pilgrimage to Japan, Korea, and China. When I read an article highly recommending it in a recent number of the Times Literary Supplement, I felt much elated as if it were my own work. So close do you dwell in my bosom, and probably in the bosoms of all Japanese who love you because they love their handmade paper. I should very much like to have a copy myself. Is it not possible to obtain it through you at a somewhat reduced price? As I am not so well off, I ask you this very rude and forward favor." In his reply, Hunter wrote that he was trying to locate a copy of A Papermaking Pilgrimage to send to Bunshō. About a month later, Bunshō mailed the first issue of Washi Danzo, published in February 1937, noting on the flyleaf, "To my friend, Dr. Dard Hunter, whose great work on Japanese, Korean, and Chinese hand papermaking is reviewed, presumably by Bunshō, with much appreciation and gratitude in this first number of Washi Danzo, or Symposium on Japanese Handmade Paper." But tensions between Japan and the US were deepening by 1937. And not surprisingly, it wasn't until after the war that the two men resumed their correspondence. While I haven't found any letters from Bunshō in American archives after 1937, in Bunshō's papers, now held by the Muko City Museum, there are several letters from Hunter to him, and the last one is dated January 17, 1949. "Dear Dr. Jugaku, your letter was received some time ago, and now the 3 books have arrived, and I hasten to thank you for your kindness. We are always pleased to receive any items from Japan, as for so many years we have not had any communication, and therefore we lost the opportunity of procuring the literature on the subject of papermaking. We are most grateful to you for sending the books, which will find a prominent place in our library, then at MIT, of Oriental papermaking material. It is fine to hear from you again and to know that you are well and still carrying on your good work. I well remember our first visit in Kyoto and only wish that I might someday return to Japan to again visit handmade paper mills. But by 1949, Hunter was suffering from asthma and heart disease, and he would no longer make any long trips. He did, however, publish one more hand-printed book with the assistance of his son, Dart Hunter II. Papermaking by Hand in America, considered Hunter's magnum opus, was published in 1950. The death of Dart Hunter in 1966 did not mark the end of interest in the history of papermaking in the US, but it could easily have signaled the demise of its manufactured by hand in America. Hunter's primary motivation in setting up his antique paper mill in Marlborough in 1912 was to learn as much as he could about the materials and techniques of hand papermaking. He had his share of failures at Marlborough, and while Hunter operated the Lime Rock Mill in the early 1930s, he did not make the paper. Instead, that was done by the Robert Robertsons, an English papermaking family that he hired, and they provided him with invaluable information about the techniques and processes of Western-style commercial hand papermaking. These experiences confirmed and deepened Hunter's belief that he had to see the craft performed firsthand, and if he was to write knowledgeably about papermaking as practiced in the East, he had to make the arduous but fruitful trips abroad in the 2 decades between the world wars. The demise of the Lime Rock Mill in the 1930s started a period of about 40 years when handmade paper was not commercially available in America. Fortunately, the craft was revived by Catherine and Howard Clark, who co-founded Twin Rocker Handmade Paper in 1972 in Brookston, Indiana. While Clark designed and built the necessary equipment and solved the technical problems, Catherine Clark was the master craftswoman at the vat. They avidly read Hunter's classic reference, Papermaking, the History and Technique of an Ancient Craft, and also corresponded with Dart II, who became their mentor, giving them advice and encouragement. In the early years, the paper that Twin Rocker made was done in small batches to the specification of artists. Now, after almost 50 years in business, Twin Rocker also makes large batches of paper kept in stock that anyone can order. Soon after beginning their enterprise, the Clarks recognized that if the craft of hand paper making was to continue in the US, others had to be trained to make paper. And so in 1974, the first Twin Rocker apprentice arrived in Brookston, quickly joined by a succession of talented and dedicated young people who wanted to make paper. These apprentices included Tim Barrett, who is Emeritus Director of the Center for the Book at the University of Iowa, and who has written extensively on Japanese and Western papermaking. The late Elaine and Sidney Koretsky, to name 2 papermaking explorers, further contributed to our knowledge by documenting their visits to Asian papermaking villages, some of which Hunter had visited a half-century before. And what about future generations? The number of US graduate programs in the book arts is at an all-time high. Letterpress printing, papermaking, and bookbinding are all enjoying a renaissance among young as well as older people who are embarking on new craft-oriented careers. Because papermaking is easy and immediate, it is a natural medium for children. One appeal is that one can create something beautiful and useful out of common plants and recycled paper. Some of these youngsters will develop an abiding interest in the craft as well as in other book arts, and Hunter would have been especially pleased by this development. After all, he wrote Papermaking in the Classroom in 1931, 90 years ago. I never met Dart Hunter. He died a few years before I embarked on my career as a paper conservator and eventually as a paper historian. If I had met him, no doubt, I would have found him a shy, modest gentleman who was generous with his knowledge if he sensed genuine interest. But I also know that no one really knew Hunter through a casual acquaintance. However, I do count myself as a friend because for almost 3 years, I lived and worked in Mountain House surrounded by artifacts, from the mundane to the awe-inspiring, created, collected, and used by him. I am charmed by his witty, often self-deprecating style revealed in his correspondences, awed by his unwavering dedication to handcrafting objects, envious of his capacity for knowledge, and inspired by his sheer determination to follow his dreams no matter the obstacles. The legacy of Dard Hunter is an outcome of his remarkable accomplishments in the way that they have both contributed to what we know about handmade paper and inspired others to follow suit. And it was in his honor that I named my imprint the Legacy Press, whose mission is to provide a publishing forum for scholars who are interested in the printing, paper, and bookbinding arts. With very few exceptions, the Legacy Press authors, including its proprietor, are dedicated to Hunter's long-held principle that to truly understand a craft, one must practice it. And in Hunter's case, he not only performed paper making, but he visited other hand paper makers around the world to see how they made paper. These days, we don't have to leave our living rooms because via our computers, smartphones, or tablets, we can view videos of seemingly every kind of craft. But while viewing a video, or even 10, about papermaking by hand might be inspirational, that can only be a starting off point. Because as Hunter's accomplishments amply demonstrate, there is simply no substitute for observing and practicing the craft firsthand, not only to enjoy the experience, but to begin to truly understand it. Thank you.